It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up.
So as you can imagine, that was not supposed to happen. But in this video, I'm going to show you how I went about making the new breakfast table that you'll see up in the corner right now for our own house using some ash and some rift-sawn white oak. I'm doing something a little bit different with this video. I typically would do a script, but I feel like that's boring. And so this one, I'm just going to try to wing it. So we'll see how it goes. What you see me doing here is laying out all of the different ash that I have for the project. And I've had this wood for like, I don't know, 2-3 years. And I've never really had anything that I wanted to do with it. But I decided to use it on this project because I'm going to be changing the color. And to me, it just didn't make a lot of sense to take the white oak that I have if I'm just going to make it black, which you'll see more on that later in the video. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a look at each one of the boards, trying to find out like what usable material I have, right? So I don't want to, take a spot that has some huge knot that I'm not going to be able to conceal. So I'm just marking each one of my pieces a little bit long because like this board in particular that you're looking at, I'm going to cut that down into 3 pieces. Well, it's wide enough that when I laminate these 3 pieces together, it's going to give me the ability to get 2 legs out of it. So I personally like to break down rough lumber like this with a jigsaw. I just find it much easier. And I'm breaking it down before going to the joiner and planer. Well, mainly because it's a lot easier to manipulate this on the jointer and the planer than a 8 or 9 foot long board. And you get better results the shorter the board is, at least from my experience. Now, once I have one edge jointed and one face jointed, I can then go ahead and plane to get the desired thickness that I want for each one of these. Now, I'm not concerned about both edges being perfect. I only want one because that will be my reference. So next, I go ahead and lay out the boards, put on a whole bunch of Titebond 3, and then get to spreading the glue. So one thing that is nice about laminating boards together is typically you can do a lot with a lot less clamps because you can do them in conjunction with each other. So as you'll notice, you already see 3 boards sandwiched together in my clamps. Well, now I'll be able to put these in, and since there's no glue on the exterior portion of the first laminated set, it doesn't stick to the other. So once I get all my glue spread, then I can go ahead and move on to getting everything clamped in place. And when I'm clamping these, we often talk about clamping pressure and, too much. When I'm doing laminations like this, like I just clamp down, clamp away. Because what I've had before in the past, because they're so tall, what I've had happen in the past is if you don't give it enough pressure in a situation like this where there's a ton of glue surface area, the problem that you end up having is that it doesn't bring the joints together all the way through. So when you go cut it back, you end up finding all these voids. So in this scenario, I'm just clamping the heck out of it. Now, while that's clamped up, I went ahead and just started milling the lumber that I was going to be using for all of my aprons. Nothing too exciting here. So I let the blanks sit overnight, and then I came back out, took off the mini clamps, and started to get to work on cleaning each one of these blanks up. And so for this, what I'm doing, typically I'd always clean out the glue squeeze out that I have while it's still wet, just because sometimes it can be kind of a pain. But again, this is all going to be milled down to the final thickness. But what I'm doing here, this was my original flat reference side. So I have this thing flipped upside down. I'm going to run this through the jointer again just to make sure that everything is perfect. And instead of trying to run it over the jointer with all these big, globs of glue, I'm just using one of these scrapers from Rockler to go ahead and remove everything. It works really, really good, especially when the blade is sharp. If the blade's not sharp, it doesn't really work so much. Imagine that. But once I get all the glue off, move over to the jointer, and we're going to go ahead and joint an edge. And then after we joint that edge, that's now my reference face or my reference surface for the bandsaw. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting that surface up against the bandsaw fence, and I'm just cutting these, as you can imagine, oversized, because I'm going to mill everything down to the final size by sending it through the planer. Now on the cut edge that I just ran through the bandsaw, I'm going to run that over the jointer, get a nice clean edge there, and then I'm ready to go ahead and start the milling process by running it through the planer. Now, what I'm doing here is labeling. So A and B are the two jointed edges. C and D are going to be the ones that I start planing. So what's important here is you have to keep track of what passes you're doing and what faces you're doing. Because if you don't, then you'll end up not having the dimensions that you want. And also, the reason why I like to do everything evenly is because it's laminated. What I'm trying to achieve is that the two outside boards, not the center one, but the two outside boards are equal. Because if they're not, it'll just look funny when you're looking at it from the side. Because obviously it's laminated, and whether it has a stain on it or not, it's going to be very obvious. So just taking the time to make sure that you are, keeping track of what faces that you need to send through, it'll really do wonders for the finished end result. After that, I could take it over to the miter saw station where I was able to cut everything down to its final size. The legs on this are 35 inches, if I remember correctly. Oh, and I guess I should say, I do have a set of plans for this table. If you guys are interested, I'll put a link down in the video description. You can get it on my website, bentswoodworking.com. It'll have all the different measurements that I used and everything else. Some different pictures. You can also purchase the SketchUp file if you want to make any modifications to the size and you are somebody that has SketchUp. So as you can see, I am clearly using the Domino XL for the joinery. I actually use the Domino XL and I use the Domino 500 on this project, mainly because in this opportunity, I got the option to use 8 by 100 millimeter dominoes for the aprons into the legs. Now on the apron pieces, after I went ahead and plunged my mortise locations, I wanted to add a little bit of a detail. So I just used one of these bullnose bits, bowl bits, and just did a nice little kind of, groove all the way down, and it's spaced equally on both sides. So I just ran it through one side and then flipped the board around, ran it through the other side. And I think it made a really cool detail, which you're going to see in the next clip where I'm using the Domino 500, which I'll talk about in a second. But I just thought it was a nice addition. I think it just gives it a little bit of extra, design element feature. I don't know what you call it. You guys get what I'm doing. So what I'm doing here with the Domino 500 is I'm actually plunging my locations for the Z-clips that I'm going to use to attach to the tabletop to the base, which you will see right there. And I actually have on my Instagram a little story that tells you the settings and everything that I use for that. Now, before I went ahead and did my dry fit, I could add my favorite roundover bit ever, which is the 1/8 inch roundover, which I use probably more than any router bit that I own, because I really like to break up a sharp edge on just about everything. And I found that an 1/8 inch is just right. I actually do want to get the 16th inch now that I think about it, just to kind of compare the two. But I do that on all of my pieces. Just saves me a bunch of time and allows me to go all the way to the end when I'm doing it, instead of trying to get in corners. From there, I went ahead and did a quick rough sanding. I'm not sanding up to my final grit just yet, but a lot easier to sand these things while the pieces are laying down rather than me trying to sand everything while it's together. It's just a pain in the butt. Always better to do it beforehand. And since I did do those details, I'm able to take this little cool sanding block that 3M makes. It's basically just like a half moon piece of like foam or whatever. You can get like a harder one, a softer one. But then you can just take the regular 3M sandpaper that they have, wrap it around it, and now you have a cool little sanding block that gets into these tight little spaces. So works really well. I got one when I went and visited 3M a while back. So next it was time to go ahead and start doing the glue up. So I glued this up in 2 separate sessions, basically. Now the glue, I do want to highlight this. The glue that I'm using is Titebond Quick and Thick because I did want to get everything glued on the same day. I can't remember if I was able to get it all done on the same day, but basically this just needs like 30 minutes of clamping time, and then you can take it out of the clamps. So, but one thing that I will say is that if it's a very intricate glue up, then I definitely wouldn't recommend using it. But the other reason I really like it is because it dries completely clear. So there's no worry of, this awkward color as it dries, whatever. You guys know what I mean. Like Titebond 3, right? It tends to dry a lot darker. But this stuff dries really clear. Now, you still get squeeze out, right? But with the Quick and Thick, you typically don't get all the running, which is helpful. But whatever squeeze out I get, all I do is I just spray it with some water, and I take this little brush and I get in the corners and just get everything out of there real nice. And it leaves, zero glue residue behind, and works really well. So if you didn't know that, now you do. All right, so I have the 2 end pieces glued together. They're already out of clamps. What I'm doing here, this is just a dry fit. I have my 2 long stretchers attached with the dominoes. And what I'm doing is I'm just getting my measurements to figure out what size my 2 middle supports need to be. And once I get those cut, I just slide them into place. And, luckily they fit pretty much perfectly on the first try. Now what I'm doing is I'm marking the spacing that I want them. I basically just wanted to, split this area into 3 sections, and then that gives me a really easy reference. And the way that I'm attaching these is, again, with the domino, but this time I use a domino 500, and I'm using, I think, 5x40 dominoes, if I remember correctly. And the reason I use the 5 is because really all I'm trying to do here is, put something there to support the span of the table. So I don't need anything wider, but the boards themselves are only an inch thick. So the 5mm by 40mm domino works kind of perfect for this application. So now it's time for the glue up. And I'm speeding this one up a little bit here because there's a lot of stuff that is going to happen. But more importantly, what's going to happen is I'm going to show you how dumb I can be sometimes. Like, why would I do this? It makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. Yeah, I just put those things in there. Just put them in. Why would they stay in place when I go to lift this thing up? Well, they don't. And they knock over my piece. And luckily, nothing was damaged from that. Luckily, did I say I got lucky? I don't know. All right. But anyways, after I figured that out, not to do that, I went ahead and continued on with my glue up, being a little bit smarter about it and not putting myself in a position that I would regret later. And the glue up went, fairly well. Anytime you're using dominoes, I mean, it's an amazing tool, right? Like it just makes assembly of something so much easier, so much faster, and that has the added benefit of it making it much stronger. So get everything glued together and then get it in the clamps. And here I used the parallel clamp extenders from Bessie. And these things are fantastic because there are certain times where you don't have enough length with whatever clamps that you have, and you need to get a little bit of extra length out of those. And these extenders work perfectly for that. And I've never noticed, them having any issues with not applying the right clamping pressure. But the alternative to this would have been one, either go buy a much longer pipe clamp, spend a bunch of money, or buy the even longer Bessie parallel clamps, which, I mean, if anybody buys parallel clamps, they know that they're, kind of expensive. They're great clamps, but they're kind of expensive. So these extenders basically give you a whole bunch of other clamps in your shop. So when I'm getting this thing all glued together, before I clamp it down, I am making sure that each one of my stretchers is square using, you guessed it, a square. And then I clamp it in place. So while that is drying, wait a minute, it's already dry because I'm literally on video right now measuring the table base in a different location with no clamps on it. I'm sorry. So what I'm doing is I'm measuring the finished size of this table base because that is going to dictate the size of my top, which I already had all this stuff planned out, but sometimes you make cuts and do things and something ends up being a little bit different. So it's kind of just verifying. But essentially what I was doing is verifying the size because I want there to only be a 1/4 inch overhang around the edges of the legs. So I want to make sure that I build this top to the exact size that I want it. And before I had mentioned that I was using some Riffsawn white oak. This is my absolute favorite looking wood to work with. I obviously used to use a lot of walnut on things, but my wife is really, really into the white oak. And I like white oak if it's Riffsawn white oak. I'm not as big of a fan of traditional flat sawn white oak. I just think the Riffsawn and the straight lines looks really cool. Anyways, I'm blabbing. So what I'm doing here, this is all from Hartzell Hardwoods. That's where all of this lumber that you see in this video is from. Now, what you see me doing here, I'm not like checking the boards to see if I like the layout. What I'm looking for is usable space and where I'm going to need to cut each one of those boards to give me the best 60 inches in this case. I need 60 inches for each board, so I'll probably cut them at 65, 68. And just trim them to final length once they're all glued up. But I want to take the best parts of these pieces. And so the easiest way to do that is just look at each one of your boards and figure out, what needs to be cut off, what is usable, what's not usable. And it's not as simple as, just throwing a piece of wood up on the miter saw and chopping off the end. And, because there might be checking in the end, there might be a knot on the end, and you can really pick and choose where you want, or what you want to use, basically. All right, so you guys get it. And when I mark these, I always, you can see a red X, probably, maybe you can see it. But that's always as a reminder for me that is going to be my off cut, just so I know I don't need to cut on whatever side of the line. It doesn't matter. And again, like I mentioned before, I really, really rather break down these rough pieces like this that don't have a clean edge at my assembly table using a jigsaw, because again, I leave everything oversized, so it doesn't need to be perfect, and it's just safer, to be quite honest with you. Now, the first thing that I needed to do after that is establish a nice, clean reference edge, because I need to cut all these things down to size after I run them through the joiner and planer. Well, since these are 60 inches long, and some of them had some, pretty gnarly bows or crowns to the edge, it's a lot easier for me to cut these using my sliding table saw. And this is just another amazing example of why I absolutely love this machine. I mean, it is a dream to use. And again, I can get a way better result doing this. And it's a lot faster than me trying to manage these longer boards. Now, 60 inches isn't very long. I could have done this on the jointer, no problem, but very easy, very quick, and very good results. So what I actually did this time was, after I got my clean edge, I then used the fence as a reference, and I just trimmed off, maybe, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch at most. And that was really just to kind of keep the blade captured in between the wood, so the dust collection wasn't completely awful. But what I'm doing here is just getting them to the final width. Now, every board is a different width, but I take each board and make the adjustments based on what is available. And then I always give myself like one extra board. So then that way when I'm going and laying everything out, if something doesn't work, I can go ahead and use that and replace another board. So here, this is all of the boards. Nice, and the edges, clean. I am going to take these and run them through the jointer now for two reasons. One, I want to clean up any saw marks. Not that I'm a real big believer that actually matters. I've glued plenty of things together that had track saw marks and you wouldn't know. So, but I'm going to do it in this scenario. But the other reason, more importantly, is I want to make sure that these joints come together like absolutely perfect. And I'm sure that a lot of people have probably seen the old trick of taking one board and jointing it in one direction and then taking the board next to it and jointing it the opposite way. And what that does is even if my fence was not perfectly 90, because I'm doing the opposite on each board, they come together absolutely perfect. And it works very well. Like, it's totally makes sense, and it absolutely works. And it definitely worked here, because as soon as I ran each one of those through, bring it back over, push them together, and we have a nice, perfect, tight joint. So if you didn't know that, again, now you do. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and start laying out my markings for my biscuits. And yes, I did just say biscuits because I am using biscuits to align this tabletop. Now, does it add any strength? It's not the point of it, right? The point of this is that I just want these boards to come together perfectly. And because I don't have a huge wide belt sander, I don't want to have to spend a bunch of time trying to sand ridges out of my tabletop. I want it to be nice and flat like it should be when you glue things up. So to do that, I'm using biscuits. Now, Jason, why would you not use the domino? And for those of you that are wondering if there's a strength benefit to using the biscuits over the domino, I'll be quite honest with you. The reason why I'm using the biscuits is because I have a biscuit joiner. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. Like, why not? I've shown use the domino a bunch of times, so why not use the biscuit joiner? Yes, it's the lamello, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a biscuit joiner. It is also the Zeta P2. That's for another video. Now, I'm going pretty heavy on my markings here. One, because I have a box of like 3,000 biscuits that I got when I bought the lamello. So I figured I need to use them. But more importantly, if you have any like serious deviation in your boards, the more biscuits and or dominoes, whatever you choose to use, the better, right? Because it's more areas that are going to be in alignment with one another, right? So there's no reason to skimp. Now, if your boards are like absolutely perfectly flat, then you don't need as many. But here I'm using a whole bunch of them. So, like I said, using the biscuit joiner. So the Zeta P2, which is what I have, that's the one that has like the Clamex connectors and the Tenso connectors, and you can do the Vario system, all these cool, awesome things that lamello makes, right? So it's truly a remarkable machine. It's fantastic. But I bought the Zeta P2 because it gives me the ability to do both. All you have to do is change out the blade and deactivate the plunge setting that actually causes the blade to go up and down. So it works really well, and it's great. And the dust collection on it is fantastic. So yeah, you probably don't need to watch me do this anymore. So let's move on. Now the glue up. So this time I'm not using Titebond Quick and Thick. Instead, I'm using Titebond 3, which is what I primarily use. But I do find myself using the Quick and Thick a lot more now. But what I'm doing is I'm gluing this up in two sections, and then I'll glue the two sections together. It's just easier to manipulate and manage. I can stand on each side of the table, do both sides. I mean, it's a pretty basic glue up, right? I just throw a bunch of glue on there, put in all my biscuits, spread it all out, start putting the boards together. I'm not really worried about using excess glue and having to clean that up because that's all coming. That's all going to be easy. But once you get all the pieces together, it's as easy as just taking the two halves and putting those two halves together. It's just a lot easier to manage than, trying to like reach over the table and pull the stuff together. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to use multiple clamps, but before I put any top clamps on, I'm going to clean off all of the glue that is visible. Now, here's something that's interesting. So you see, as I slide that card scraper, that's a card scraper. It's an old card scraper. It's totally dull. I've always just used that specific one for like glue cleanup, getting in corners, that kind of stuff. I have a good one in my apron, but what I do is I scrape that glue off. And so something that you'll actually end up seeing or noticing when you do that, if you had a successful glue up and everything is nice and even, you'll know right away, because as you scrape that glue off, it's not going to leave a bunch of residue behind. Like it'll actually all, kind of come off. So you will see areas where I do have a little bit more residue than others. That might be spaces where, the board was just ever so slightly higher. And still nothing too serious, pretty easy to get off with when they take out the Rotex and sand everything back. So once I get all of the glue cleaned up on the top, I didn't show it on camera here, but I do like to stand this thing up and clean all the glue off the backside. But what I'm doing now is I'm going through and I'm just checking the clamping pressure. I actually did a video about this, why I'm using a straight edge on each one of the clamps. So the straight edge actually tells me if I'm applying too much clamping pressure, or in some cases, if I'm not applying enough, right? Because I want this panel to be flat, but the tighter you go on, tightening down those clamps, it'll start to make the boards bow. And a very easy way to visually see that is by using the straight edge. So if you haven't seen that video, I definitely recommend going and checking that out. So like I said, moving on to sanding. Now that everything was done, I always start. So this is kind of the way that I sand pretty much all the time, right? One, I use the 3M Cubitron 2, the 775L, not the mesh stuff. I use the mesh stuff as well, but my favorite is the 775. Now, I always start with 80 grit, and I always start with the Rotex. So I'll do the Rotex with 80 grit, and from there, sometimes I'll move up to 120 with the Rotex, but usually not. Usually I'll go 80, and then I'll switch up to 120 using the ETS EC 150/5, and then I'll go through the grits after that, which we'll talk more about that when I start doing that sanding portion. After I was done doing the rough sanding, right, just the 80 grit, just to get all the residue off, I take it over to my sliding table saw and I cut this thing down to the final size. Now, I do have to take a little bit off each end, and I also have to take a little bit off each side. And the reason for that is because I want the two pieces that are on the outside, again, kind of like with the legs, to be as close to even as possible, because these are not going to be a different color. It will be completely visible. So if I cut too much off one side, it'll look like I have this weird little sliver on the end, and I don't want to do that. So I use one side as a reference, and I cut one edge. And then I can use that edge as my reference to cut one side, whatever the spacing is, to make it equal on both sides. And then I flip the board over using that edge that I cut, and I cut the other side. And now from this point, it doesn't matter what side I use as a reference. I can trim the other side. And the end result is a nice, perfectly square piece of wood. Imagine that. So, yeah, got to finagle this thing around. But I'll tell you, God, it's just such a great tool. Such a great tool. I really need an outfeed table now that I'm watching this. Really need an outfeed table. I have to take care of that. All right, let's see how it fits. I am going to tell you guys, it fits really well. Pretty much exactly how I wanted it. So now let's go ahead and start working on the finish work for this base. So here I'm using, I got to tell you guys about these. So these are these sanding sponges from Festool, and they make a hard one, a soft one, and then they make like a rectangular one. The rectangular one actually comes with a Conturo kit, but you can buy a kit of all three of these, or you can buy these individually. So when I was at Hartville, I actually found the little sustainer that had all three, and I bought them, and I'm so glad that I did, because they have the hook and loop stuff on them, and they actually take, your regular sandpaper, and they just wrap around it perfectly, and it makes sanding things with a sanding block so much more enjoyable. But what I was doing there is I was sanding it at my highest grit that I wanted to go to, which in this case was 180, which is, quite honestly, that's usually about as high as I go, period. But actually, I may have done 220 on this one. I don't know. I can't remember. 180 or 220, one of the two. And I'm using India ink, right? So I wanted a black base, and I was going to use Rubio Monocoat, Precolor Easy, and then Oil Plus 2C black. I did a test piece, and it's very thick. It's pretty thick. It's not very thick. It's pretty thick. So it didn't get down into the pores and the grain of the wood nearly as good as I would have liked it to. So somebody had mentioned to me on Instagram, they're like, hey, have you thought about using India ink? And I've always wanted to use India ink. I didn't even think about it for this project. So I was like, no. So I bought a bottle, and that bottle that I showed you cost $18, 18 bucks. And I used maybe a tenth of the bottle for the entire base. It is super runny. It was one of the most enjoyable experiences that I have ever had applying any finish, because it's just instantaneous gratification, taking that ash from its light color to that pitch black. I did not have any lap line problems, nothing like that. I just used this foam brush. I brushed it on, and if there was a bunch of excess, I just went over it. I mean, it worked flawlessly. I cannot say enough good things about using India ink if you're looking for something to be really, really, really dark. It's just awesome, and it is so fun to do and so easy to do. Oh, and by the way, it's shellac based, so it dries incredibly fast. I mean, it was done in like, I don't know, 30 minutes dry, completely like parts of the base were dry while I was doing this right here. So, I mean, really phenomenal. I will 100% be using this again on another project. So I set that off to the side. Then I could start focusing on working on the tabletop. So I do have some finishing touches that I need to make on this. So the first of those finishing touches is I do like I always do, and I do an 1/8 round over just to break up that sharp edge. God, I just love the way that looks. And then I go into my sanding. So this is what I was talking about. This is my ETS EC 150/5. It is the 5-stroke. I think this is honestly the best all-around sander that you can buy. I get asked that a lot. I have a video that talks about the sanders if you want to know my reason why I think it's the best sander. But I go 120, 150, 180 on this top, and I call it quits. Then I can go ahead and clean it. So this, I'm using some Rubio raw wood cleaner. Honestly, I think that this is just mineral spirits. It acts exactly the same as mineral spirits, but what I'm doing is I'm cleaning off the surface because I want to make sure that there's nothing underneath it for the finish that I am using. I would use this also if I was using Rubio Monocoat. The finish that I'm using is what might be one of my new favorite finishes ever for clear coats. And that is a finish called Renner 718. And you can't order this online. That's how I ordered mine, out of a place in Mansfield, Ohio. I'll leave the company down in the video description. But it's expensive, but it is fantastic. And the reason that I am stirring it is because it is a 2K, two-part product. It's 5% to whatever you do. So if I did 100 ounces, then I would do 5% of that in the catalyst, which is what you saw me sucking into the syringe. But that's what I'm spraying on this thing. 3 coats. 3 coats of this finish. And the reason why this finish is so awesome, I use it on my kitchen island, is because it doesn't even look like there's finish on there, and it's extremely durable, being a 2K. Now, the Renner 718 itself is water-based. The solvent-based part is the catalyst that you need, but you don't need a lot of it. And the smell isn't super bad, but it's enough for me to be wearing the mask, and that I don't want to be hanging out in the shop. Now, this stuff is great because it dries super fast. I think within an hour, I'm out there putting on the second coat, sanding and putting on the second coat. And that's a question that I've gotten a lot. If people are like, well, if it's a 2-part and it has a catalyst, like what's the shelf life? So once you mix that, you have, I think it's 3 to 4 hours. I was able to fill that container up on the Graco and get all 3 coats of my finish applied to not only the top, but also the base within that time limit. So I didn't have to like mix up any additional stuff. Now, if you're going to spend a lot more time in between coats, then yeah, I recommend that you mix it appropriately. But do 1 coat. I go back over with that sanding sponge I was telling you about, the sanding pad block, whatever it is, from Festival, with some Cubitron. I want to say I used 320. And really the only thing I'm doing there is I'm just trying to smooth it out, right? Like the first coat, you're going to get little nibs and stuff. But for the most part, it was pretty dang smooth. But it's just to smooth everything out. Then you can go back, clean it, put on your second coat. And what I did is I actually applied my 3 coats to the top, and then I came over here and applied what was left in the container for my first coat here. So I did have to mix a little bit more, but it's only because I ran out. And I know some of you guys are probably looking at this going, oh my God, look at all that overspray. Why are you doing that? The overspray is not that bad. It really isn't. Like, as you can see, I sprayed this thing on top of my assembly table with a plastic cloth down. Like, the stuff that goes up in the air atomizes quickly and it just falls down as dust, right? It's not a big deal. And actually my air filtration system that I have the Powermatic, and I actually have like an automatic on and off switch from Grit Automation, which turns it on. It's really cool because it'll sense that I'm spraying and it'll actually turn the thing on all by itself. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. So what I'm doing here is I'm using Z-clips to attach the tabletop to the base. And I use these all the time, right? They're just great. They're cheap. I get them from Rockler. I think you get like 10 in a pack for like a few bucks. But they work really well, as long as you do the slot that they go into the proper way. And so from there, it's done. And I don't know if you can tell in the picture here, but that's 3 coats of finish. It has zero sheen. Zero sheen. So it looks completely natural. And man, God, it's just a great finish. Absolutely great. The black even looks natural on the base. But here we are putting our super high quality IKEA chairs, which my son and I built. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We built it together. And yeah, new table in the breakfast room, perfect size. Had to get out the wife and her big guns to help me get this thing inside. And there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for watching.